Okay, good morning. So for today, we're going to have a discussion all about the experiment one, which is all about your kinematics and dynamics. Now, this experiment actually connects a basic physics concept with your biological movement. And in this discussion, we will be discussing how motion is measured, how force affects movement, and how this idea affect your human gait, movement of slopes, force generation throughout the body. So those are our topic now for this morning. By the end of this discussion, you guys should be able to explain how motion-related variables are measured in biological systems. You should also be able to explain how stride length and gait frequency affect walking, how ramp angle affects acceleration, and how Newton's law help explain movement and force generation. Now, the goal here is not to only compute for the values, but the goal is to interpret what those values mean in a biological or biomechanical context. Now, let's begin with reviewing the difference between kinematics and dynamics. Kinematics describes the motion without analyzing the forces that caused it. This includes displacement, speed, velocity, acceleration, and time. Meanwhile, dynamics explains motion by looking at forces and torques. And this is where your Newton's law of motion becomes important. Now, in this experiment, we have performed the gait activity, mostly using kinematics, because we describe walking using distance, time, steps, speed, stride length, and gait frequency. For the dynamics, that involves the cart and wall push activity because we explain acceleration and forces using your Newton's law of motion. Now, in terms of biological importance of motion, motion is not only a physics concept, it is also central to living organism. Organisms move for locomotion, for balance, for posture, escape, hunting, foraging, and survival. In humans, motion is important for daily mobility, for rehabilitation, for physical therapy, for prosthetics, sports science, and biomechanics. So we analyze motion mathematically. We are just solving equation in this case, and we are actually building a basic framework for understanding how the body moves, how the body maintains posture, and how it interacts with the environment. Now, these experiments have three major parts. The first part was human gait and walking kinematics. Here, you actually measured walking speed, stride length, and gait frequency. The second part is the acceleration of the cart in an inclined plane. So here, you examine how the slope angle affects your acceleration. Okay? And then for the third part, that was for reaction force during an arm push. Here, you actually applied your Newton's third law of motion, and you have observed how force is transmitted through the body. Now, these three parts are connected. First, we describe motion. Second, we explain acceleration. And third, we actually explain force interaction. Let's start with the first part, which is all about human gait and walking kinematic. Now, for part one, we analyzed human walking using measurable motion variables. The measured variables were the distance walked, the time taken, and the number of steps. So from these measurements, we calculated average speed, the stride length, and the gait frequency. Now, this is a relatively simple activity, but it is important because walking is one of the most common biological movement. Even a basic walking trial can show how the body coordinates distance, time, rhythm, and step size. So there are two gait equations that we actually use. We have the stride length that would be equal to the distance divided by the number of steps. And we have the gait frequency that would be the number of steps divided by time. So average speed describes how fast the student covered the total walking distance. A shorter walking time produces higher average speed. And for longer walking time, it produces lower average speed. Okay, we can actually calculate for the average speed using this equation. Average speed is equal to the distance over time. So this tells us how fast the student completed the 10-meter part. So if two students both walk 10 meters, the students who finishes in a shorter time has the higher average speed. For example, if one student finishes in 8 seconds and another student finishes in 10 seconds, the first student has a higher average speed because the same distance was covered in less time. However, average speed alone does not explain how the student move actually. To understand gait more deeply, we also have to look at the two variables here. We have your stride length and we have your gait frequency. Let's start with the stride length. It describes the distance covered per unit of steps. So if the stride length is longer, the student covers more distance with each step and may need fewer steps to complete the 10-meter path. If the stride length is shorter, the student covers less distance per step and may need more step. Now, in biological terms, stride length may be influenced by the leg length. It could be influenced by the posture, by walking style, flexibility, balance, and comfort. Another variable that we have measured in this experiment is your gait frequency, which describes how many steps are taken per unit time. A high gait frequency means that the student is taking more steps per second, and a low gait frequency means the student is taking fewer steps per second. Now, this matters because two people can walk at the same speed using different strategies. One may use longer steps at a slower rhythm, another may use shorter steps at a faster rhythm. So this is why gait analysis is more informative than simply asking who walked the fastest. Now, the key relationship is walking velocity is equal to the stride length multiplied by the gait frequency. This means walking velocity can increase in three ways. First, the stride length may increase. Second, your gait frequency may increase. And third, both of them may increase at the same time. Therefore, when you interpret your data, do not only report the speed, no, ask what caused that speed. Was it due to longer steps? Was it due to faster stepping or a combination of both? Okay? Now, let's apply those equations in this problem. A student walks a 10-meter path in 8 seconds, and it takes 16 steps. So we are given here the distance, which is 10 meters, the time it takes to cover that distance, which is 8 seconds, and steps, which is 16. So we're going to find the stride length, the gait frequency, and the velocity. Now, again, for the stride length, that would be equal to the distance over the number of steps. The total distance that we covered is 10 meters. So 10 meters divided by the number of steps, which is 16 steps. So this will give how much? Okay, so let's try to call from the audience. Sakweza, what would be the value of our stride length in this case?
The value of stride length po is 0.625 meters per
0.
steps po. 0.625.
625 meters per step. So that would be the unit of your stride length. Now, for your gait frequency, that would be equal to the number of steps divided by time. So the total number of steps that the student took is 16 steps. So we just have to do that, 16 steps divided by 8 seconds. So what would be the value of our gait frequency here, Acosta?
Um, 2 steps per second po.
2 steps per second. Okay, so we have already calculated for the stride length and the gait frequency. Now we just have to multiply your stride length with your gait frequency to obtain your velocity. So again, velocity is just equal to the stride length multiplied by your gait frequency. So this would be equal to 0.625 meters per step. Please do not forget the units multiplied by 2 steps per second. So just cancel the number of steps. This will give us a velocity value of what, Garcia?
1.25 meters per second po.
Okay, so that's correct. 1.25 meters per second. So students' walking velocity in this case is 1.25 meter per second. Now, the interpretation for this is that this student covered 0.625 meters per step and took 2 steps per second to have the velocity of 1.25 meters per second. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if everything is clear so far? Okay. Now, for another problem, the stride length of this student is 0.70 meters per step, and the gait frequency is 1.8 steps per second. We just have to find the walking velocity. This is just a simple application of direct substitution. In this problem, you can calculate for the velocity. No, that would be equal to the stride length multiplied by the gait frequency. So we are given here 0.7 meters per step multiplied by 1.8 steps per second. So just cancel the number of steps here. This will give you a unit of meters per second. What would be the value here, Madrinyan?
Sir, 1.26 meter per second po.
Okay, so that would be correct. 1.26 meters per second. Now, the step unit here cancels out, leaving only your meters per second. And this example shows that walking velocity is not just about moving legs quickly. It actually depends on how far each step moves in the body and how frequently those steps occur. Okay. Next, we have this problem. We have 2 students walking 10 meters. For student A, the total time is 8 seconds and it took student A 14 steps to cover your 10 meters. For student B, the same time, 8 seconds, but it took student B 20 steps to cover that 10 meters. So we're going to find the stride length, the gait frequency, and the velocity of each student. Let's start with student A. Student A here. So let's calculate first for the stride length. I'll just call stride length as SL. I'll call your gait frequency as GF, and I'll call velocity as V. So SL here is equal to the distance over number of steps. So for this one, we have 10 meters divided by 14 steps, which will give us a value of how much? Arceo, what would be the value of our stride length for student A? Arceo, are you here? 0.71 meters per step. Okay, so let's write that down. 0.71 meters per step. How about for the gait frequency of student A? So for this one, we could calculate for the gait frequency as the number of steps per time. So in this case, we will have 14 steps divided by 8 seconds, which will give us how much? Regio.
1.75 steps per second.
Okay, so that's correct now. 1.75 steps per second. So this will give us a total velocity of, just multiply both of the values. Punzalan. What would be the velocity?
1.24 meters per seconds.
Okay, so 1.24 meters per second. So that would be the velocity of student A. How about for student B? Okay, so let's calculate for the SL of student B. That would be the distance traveled by student B, still 10 meters, divided by the number of steps done by student B. So that would be 20 steps. What would be the value of the stride length of student B here, Guevara?
0.5 meters per steps po.
Okay, so 0.5 meters per step. How about for the gate frequency of student B? So that would be equal to the number of steps, 20 steps, divided by 8 seconds. So what would be the value here? Zaraga.
2.5 steps per second po.
2.5 steps per second. Okay, how about for the velocity? What would be the value of the velocity if we multiply the stride length and the gate frequency of student B? Pareha.
Wait lang po, sir. Sorry.
Okay.
5 times 1.25 po.
Still 1.25 meters per second.
Per
There is a
second.
slight difference here, maybe in the rounding off, but as you can see, there is a difference between the stride length and the gate frequency of student A and student B, even though they almost have the same velocity. So student A here used longer steps, but in a slower stepping rhythm. Meanwhile, student B used shorter steps but faster stepping rhythm. Now, this is the main lesson for this problem. The same walking velocity may be achieved using different gate strategies. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if everything is clear so far? Okay. Now, this table helps us interpret the gate data. If a student has a longer stride length, it just means that the student covers more distance per step. Now, if a student has a higher gate frequency, it means that the student takes more steps per second. If a student has a higher average speed, it means that the student completed the 10-meter path in less amount of time. However, be careful because a student with many short steps may still walk quickly if the gate frequency is high. A student with fewer long steps may also walk quickly if the stride length is large. So in your analysis, you should not stop at the velocity. The discussion must explain the combination of stride length and your gate frequency. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if everything is clear so far? Okay. Now, let's compare speed and velocity. They are related, but they are not exactly the same. For speed, that is a scalar quantity. It actually tells us how fast an object moves, but it does not include direction. For your velocity, this is a vector quantity. It tells us both how fast an object moves and in what direction it moves. And in this experiment, because you students walk along a straight path, speed and velocity may appear numerically similar. However, in real movement, especially when there are turns, stops, changes in the direction, or curve paths, velocity becomes more informative because for velocity, direction matters. Now, the question here was, is walking uniform or accelerated? Now, the best answer for this question is actually conditional. Walking may be treated as approximately uniform if you, the student, maintained a steady pace, had a consistent step rhythm, and did not obviously speed up or slow down. However, in real-life scenario, that is practically impossible. So walking may involve acceleration if the student started from rest, increased speed during the trial, or slowed near the end. Or you can also change your walking acceleration by changing the step frequency. In actual human walking, there is usually acceleration at the start, possible steady movement in the middle, and deceleration near the end. Therefore, the measured value is best interpreted as the average speed over the entire 10-meter path. Now, in terms of human gait cycle, it consists of repeated cycles. So we have your stance phase. It occurs when the foot is on the ground. It supports the body weight and helps propulsion. And this movement or this phase of your human gait cycle accounts for about 60% of that cycle. We also have your swing phase, which occurs when the foot moves through the air and prepares for the next step. And this cycle accounts for about 40% of the human gait cycle. Now, this is important because even when walking looking smooth, the body is constantly shifting between support and movement. Walking is not just simple translation across a straight path. It is also a coordinated cyclic motion involving your muscles, involving your joints, involving balance, and involving ground interaction. Now, gait analysis is useful in rehabilitation, sports science, prosthetics, physical therapy, balance assessment, mobility studies, and biomechanics. If you are planning to work on these fields in the future, you will apply the equations and the concepts learned for human gait and walking kinematics. For example, in rehabilitation, gait data can help determine whether a patient has abnormal step length or just poor balance. In sports science like basketball, volleyball, gait analysis can help evaluate running efficiency and movement mechanics. In prosthetics, when you are designing prosthetic limbs, gait analysis helps determine whether an artificial limb supports natural or stable movement. So computations in these laboratory experiments are actually simple, but the concept is foundational. Are we clear with that? Are we clear with human gait and walking kinematics? Question so far, guys. You still follow? Can I get a thumbs up if you can still follow the discussion? Okay. Now, let's move to part 2 of this experiment, which is all about acceleration of the cart on an inclined plane. For part 2, we examined how slope affects acceleration. The ramp here was set at 10 degrees, 20 degrees, and 30 degrees. And the distance traveled was fixed at 1 meter. Now, the cart was released without pushing and 3 trials were done for each angle. The cart was released without pushing because the goal of this experiment was to observe acceleration caused mainly by gravity, not by an added force from the student. Okay? Now, this experiment applies the Newton's second law of motion. It states that your force is equal to the mass multiplied by the acceleration. The meaning here is direct, guys. Greater net force produces greater acceleration. Greater mass resists acceleration. And acceleration occurs only when there is non-zero net force. And in this activity, the cart accelerates because a component of gravity acts along that ramp. Okay? Now, in this part, a cart on an inclined plane is affected by gravity. However, not all of gravity pulls the cart down the ramp. Only the component of the gravitational force parallel to the slope causes the cart to accelerate along the ramp. So, in terms of the free body diagram of this experiment, we have here your cart and it is being inclined on an inclined plane. We have two forces here acting upon your cart. We have the weight of the cart and the normal force exerted by the cart to the inclined plane. So we call this normal force. In this experiment, we assume that your friction is negligible. However, in real life, you have to account for friction. So friction in this case is the one that resists the motion of that cart. This is the free body diagram. Okay? Now, the component of this equation would be equal to the force of your cart along the ramp is equal to the mass of the cart multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity, which is always equal to 9.81 meters per second squared if you are on Earth. If you change planets, of course, the value of acceleration due to gravity will change because different planets, different celestial bodies, they have their own acceleration due to their own gravity. Okay, and then both of these values, the mass and the acceleration due to gravity, was multiplied by sine theta, which accounts for the angle of inclination. Okay, so as the angle becomes larger, sine theta becomes larger as well. Therefore, the downhill force component becomes larger. Okay, so applying Newton's second law, force is equal to mass times acceleration. For the ramp, that would be force is equal to the mass of the cart multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity, multiplied by the angle of inclination, sine angle of inclination. Therefore, if you substitute equation 1 to equation 2, this will give you mass times acceleration is equal to mass times the acceleration due to gravity sine theta. And since mass can be seen on both sides of the equation, we can cancel it out. So we can calculate for the theoretical acceleration of the cart, that would be acceleration is equal to the acceleration due to gravity sine theta. Now, the problem here is it does not account for frictional forces. So for this one, theoretical acceleration increases as the ramp angle increases. This is the theoretical acceleration of the cart on an ideal frictionless incline. The important point is that acceleration depends on the angle of your ramp. Okay? In terms of the expected trend, as the ramp angle increases, the sine theta increases, therefore your mg sine theta increases, therefore your acceleration increases. And in terms of the graph, the expected order is the acceleration at 30-degree angle is greater than the acceleration at 20-degree angle of incline, and both of them is greater than the acceleration at 10 degrees angle of inclination. Okay, so the cart should accelerate most at the 30-degree angle and least at the 10-degree angle. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if that is clear? Okay. Now, because the distance is fixed at 1 meter, the cart should take the longest time at 10 degrees, an intermediate time at 20 degrees, and the shortest time at 30 degrees. The expected angle of acceleration, or rather the expected acceleration, should be lowest at 10 degrees, intermediate at 20 degrees, and highest at 10 degrees. In terms of the trending, again, acceleration at 30 degrees is greater than the acceleration at 20 degrees, and that is greater than the acceleration at 10 degrees. For the trending of the time at 30-degree angle, because the acceleration is much faster, that is less than. Okay, less than the time it takes for the cart to travel 1 meter at the 20-degree angle of inclination, and those values are less than the time it takes for the car to travel the same distance at the angle of inclination of 10 degrees. Okay? So again, the car should move the fastest at the steepest angle, and the car should move the slowest at the lowest angle. So when you are looking at your data, check whether your results follow this pattern. Now, if they do not, then you need to explain why. In real life, that does not happen. So possible reason includes friction, timing error, ramp angle error, and inconsistent release. Okay, so let's use that equation and those concepts in solving this problem. A car travels 1 meter down a 10-degree ramp in 1.60 seconds. So we are given the distance, which is 1 meter per second, and the time of 1.60 seconds. Okay, we're going to calculate for the experimental acceleration here, not the theoretical acceleration. So we're not going to use this equation yet. Okay, now we have learned in the pre-lab discussion that your distance can be equal to the initial velocity times the time plus the 1/2 of your acceleration multiplied by your time squared. Okay, since in this case the cart starts from rest, we have 0 initial velocity, so you can just consider this part of the equation as 0. This will give us an equation of 1/2 AT squared. And in this case, the acceleration is just equal to the acceleration due to gravity because we did not do any assist to the cart. We just let it slide down the ramp. Okay? And we are to find the acceleration here, the experimental acceleration. So we just have to modify this equation, cross multiply 2 on the other side. This will give us 2s is equal to AT squared. And we have to cross multiply t on the other side of the equation as well. That will give us 2s over t squared. Okay, now substituting the values of your given, this will give us 2 times 1 meter over 1.60 seconds squared. So acceleration in this case will give us a value of how much? Villarin. Villarin, are you here? How about Contreras?
Hello, sir.
Ah, yes, I can hear you, Villarin.
Uh,
What would be the value of
0.78
acceleration? Sorry?
0.78 po.
Yes, so the unit for that one is meters per second squared. Please don't forget the unit. 0.78 meters per second squared. This is the experimental acceleration based on the measured time. Again, this could have some sources of error such as inconsistent release time, friction, etc., etc. Okay? Now, let's use the equation we have learned earlier to calculate for the theoretical acceleration of the car. So we are given here three angles, 15 degrees, 25 degrees, and 35 degrees. So let's start with your 15-degree angle for the equation. Acceleration is equal to the acceleration due to gravity sine theta. Okay, acceleration is equal to 9.81 meters per second squared. Again, this is only true if you are on Earth. If you leave the planet, of course, you will change this value of acceleration due to gravity. So we're going to multiply this by the sine of the angle, which is 15 degrees. What would be our theoretical acceleration here? Contreras. Contreras, are you here? Okay, Sagittarius, what would be the value of the theoretical acceleration for 15-degree angle?
Sir, 2.54 meters per second squared po.
Come again, sorry.
2.54
54 or 64?
2.54
Okay, so
54 po
2.54 meters
meters per
per
second
second
squared.
square. Okay, that's correct. Okay, how about for the 25-degree angle? So we're just going to follow the equation, 9.81 meters per second squared multiplied by the sine of 25 degrees. What would be the acceleration at a 25-degree angle of incline? Rojas.
4.15 meters
per squared second po.
4.15 meters per second squared. Okay? And then lastly, for 35-degree angle of incline, this will give us 9.81 meters per second squared multiplied by the sine of 35 degrees. This will give us a value of how much? Let's go back to Sakweza.
5.63 meters per second.
5.63
Opo.
meters per second squared. Okay, so those are the theoretical acceleration values given the angle of inclination. It's actually easier to calculate for the theoretical acceleration rather than the experimental acceleration. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if everything is clear so far? Okay. Now, for this example, a cart moves down a 20-degree ramp over a distance of 1 meter, and the measured time is 1.05 seconds. We're going to find the experimental acceleration, the theoretical acceleration, and the percent error. So again, for your experimental acceleration, we can use this equation. S is equal to dot plus 1/2 AT squared. We're just going to cancel this one out because we assume that the cart comes from rest. Okay, so this will give us S is equal to 1/2 AT squared. And then transforming this equation, it will give us acceleration of 2s over t squared. Okay, so calculating or substituting the values, this will give us 2s, which is 1 meter, over the time, which is 1.05 seconds squared. So what would be the value of our experimental acceleration, Acosta?
Um, 1.81 meters per second squared.
Okay, 1.81 meters per second squared. So this is our experimental acceleration. Now, for the theoretical acceleration, we are given a 20-degree angle of inclination. We just have to calculate. I'll going to put Theo here to differentiate it. So this one is acceleration at experimental acceleration. Okay, so theoretical acceleration is equal to the acceleration due to gravity sine 20 degrees. Okay, so this will give us 9.81 meters per second squared sine 20 degrees. So what would be our theoretical acceleration for this problem? Garcia.
3.36 meters per second squared po.
3.36 meters per second squared. So as you can observe, almost twice the value of your theoretical acceleration as compared to your actual acceleration. And we can calculate for the percent error. So percent error in this case is equal to the absolute value of the acceleration, theoretical acceleration minus the experimental acceleration over the theoretical acceleration times 100. Okay? In that case, we have 3.36 minus 1.81 over 3.36. Just put absolute value here. That means if the value is negative, you just have to make it positive. Times 100. So what would be our percent error here? Can you calculate? Madrinyan.
46.13% po.
Okay, so 46.13%. Okay? Now, in this case, the experimental value is lower, which is expected in a real setup because friction and wheel rotation reduces acceleration. Again, our assumption here is there are no outside forces acting upon your cart other than gravity. Are we clear with this, guys? Can I get a thumbs up if everything is clear so far? Okay? Now, increasing ramp angle increases the component of gravity acting along the ramp. With a lower angle, the downhill component of gravity is much smaller, so acceleration is also slower. And the time it takes to travel that certain distance is shorter. longer. But at a higher acceleration, the downhill component of your gravity is larger, so acceleration is higher and the travel time is shorter. So this is why the cart should move the fastest at 30 degrees and slowest at 10-degree angle. Now, the ideal equation assumes that there are no friction, no air resistance, a perfectly smooth ramp, no energy loss, no timing error, and no accidental push. However, in the actual experiment, it includes friction, it includes wheel rotation, surface irregularities, the stopwatch reaction time, slight release differences, and possible cart misalignment. So therefore, we should not expect perfect agreement between the theoretical and the experimental value. The key question here is whether the trend is correct. Even if the numerical values differ, acceleration should generally increase as the ramp angle increases. Even if the acceleration on the experimental part is different on the theoretical acceleration. The trend should agree. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if that is clear? Okay. Now, in the ideal case, acceleration is equal to the acceleration due to gravity multiplied by the sine theta. In the real case, the F net is equal to that equation. However, you have to account for friction. Friction reduces the net force acting on the cart, and since acceleration depends on the net force, friction also reduces the acceleration. Now, this explains why the observed acceleration is usually lower than the ideal theoretical acceleration. So please, in your discussion, do not simply write human error. Be specific. Friction decreases the net force and therefore decreases your acceleration. But then, of course, human error also plays a role in the differences in the acceleration. Maybe you have a mistimed release of the cart or mistimed stopping of your stopwatch. Now, at 10 degrees angle, the downhill gravitational component is relatively small. Because of this, friction may have stronger relative effect, and this make the car motion much slower, less consistent, and more variable. At 30 degrees, the downhill gravitational component is larger, so the cart moves more easily to overcome the friction, and acceleration becomes more noticeable. In this case, this means that the low angle trials may show greater variability than your higher angle trials. Okay? In terms of the biological meaning of inclined motion, the inclined plane models the movement on slopes. When a person moves uphill, muscles must work against gravity, more force is required, therefore energy demand increases. When a person moves downhill, muscle must control the descent, the braking force is needed, and balance in this case becomes important. This is relevant when you are hiking, when you are stair climbing from the first floor to the fourth floor, for rehabilitation exercises, in animal climbing, and for movement in uneven terrain. So the cart is a simple model, but the principle applies directly to biological motion. Okay? So in summary, the acceleration of the cart increased as the ramp angle increased. And the main explanation of that is that the force is equal to the mass multiplied by your acceleration due to gravity multiplied by the sine theta. And therefore, in terms of the theoretical calculation of your acceleration, that would be equal to the acceleration due to gravity multiplied by the sine theta. A steeper ramp creates a larger gravitational force component along the slope, causing greater acceleration. However, actual values may be lower than theory because of friction, because of wheel rotation, because of timing error, and other experimental limitations. Are we clear with that? Are we clear with the second part of your experiments? Questions? Can I get a thumbs up if you guys are following the discussion? Okay. Now, for the third part of the experiment, this is all about the reaction force during an arm push. For this one, we examined the Newton's third law using a student pushing against a wall while standing on a scale. So the measured values were baseline scale reading, the scale reading during a two-hand push, and the scale reading during your one-hand push. Then we compared one-hand and two-hand force responses. And in this part of the experiment, we actually demonstrated that the body force is not isolated. It actually depends on the interaction with the external surfaces. Okay? Let's start by defining your Newton's third law. So for every action force, there is an equal and opposite reaction force. And in this part of the experiment, you guys pushed on the wall and the wall pushes back on you. The wall may not visibly move, but it still exerts a reaction force. This is important because force does not require visible motion. A stationary wall can still exert its own force. Okay? Now, the action force is the force exerted by the student on the wall, and the reaction force is the force exerted by the wall on the student. And the force pair can be written as the force exerted by the student on the wall is equal to the negative of the force of the wall exerted on the student. Why is it negative? The negative sign here indicates that the two motion or the two forces are in opposite direction. If the student push to the east or right, the wall pushes to the west or onto your left. Okay, so this is the basis for reading the change in your scale reading. Okay, now, question here is that why the scale reading increases? The scale reading increases because the student pushes against the wall and the wall pushes back on the student. And that reaction force is transmitted through the arms, through the trunk, legs, and feet. And part of this transmitted force increases the downward force on the scale. Now, the scale here detects a larger normal force. And you guys, the mass of the student does not increase. What changes is the force transmitted through the body and to the scale. Okay, now the scale here measures your normal force. At a baseline, the normal force is mainly due to the student's body weight. For example, you are standing on the scale. So there are no other forces acting on the scale other than your weight. So your weight pushes downward here. However, during a wall push, the body weight remains the same, but additional force is being transmitted through the body. That will come from the force acted upon the wall to you. And because of this, the scale may detect an increased downward force. Now, this is why the scale reading increases during the pushing. And the correct interpretation here, guys, is not that you become heavier, but because there is a measured normal force increase due to the force exerted by the wall. Okay? Now, in general, a two-hand push may produce a higher or more stable scale reading because both arms contribute to force production and the body is more symmetrical. At one-hand push, it may be lower or more variable because it creates asymmetrical loading. The trunk may rotate, the posture may shift, and the force transition may become less stable. However, the actual result depends on the effort, depends on your posture. It depends on your foot position, arm angle, and distance from the wall. So when you write your post-lab discussion, please discuss the trend shown by their actual data. Are we clear with that? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if that is clear? Okay, let's solve some problem regarding the reaction force during an arm push. A student stands on a scale. We have a baseline reading. The weight, the mass of the student is 60 kilograms. And after doing the two-hand push, the scale reading becomes 66.5 kilograms. We're going to find the baseline force, the force during the push, and the increase in force. Think of it in this way. The student stands atop your weighing scale. And the only force acting upon the scale is the weight of that student. So that weight is equal to the force, and that force is equal to the mass of that student multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity. So this is for the baseline. Okay? So force is equal to the mass of the student, 60 kilograms, multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity, 9.81 meters per second squared. This will give us a baseline force or baseline weight of how much? What would be the value here? Arceo. Arceo, are you here? 588.6. Okay, so that's correct. 588.6. The unit here, when you multiply kilograms by meters per second squared, that will give you a value of the unit Newton. So Newton again is equal to kilograms multiplied by the acceleration. So the unit for this one is newtons. Okay, how about the force during the push? So still, we're going to follow the same equation. Force is equal to mass multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity. In this case, 66.5 kilograms multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity, which is 9.81 meters per second squared. So what would be the value of the force here? Regio.
652.37 Newton po.
Okay, 652.37 newtons. Okay. Now, to get the increase of force, in this case, we just have to subtract the force during the push minus the baseline force. Okay, so we're just going to subtract these two values. So force here, the change in force or the increase in force is equal to the force during the push minus the force of the baseline. So subtracting the two values will give us an increase of force of how much? Punzalan.
63.77 Newton.
63.77 Newton. So that's correct. Now, so again, the mass of the student did not actually increase. The scale reading increased because there is an additional force during the pushing. Are we clear with this? Can I get a thumbs up, guys, if everything is clear so far? Okay. How about for this one? A student has the following scale readings. The baseline mass is 58.0 kilograms. After a one-hand push, it becomes 61.0 kilograms. And after a two-hand push, it becomes 65.0 kilograms. So we're going to calculate for the added force during the one-hand push and the added force during the two-hand push. And then we're going to find the difference between the two pushing conditions. But instead of using the equation here at the previous problem, let's have a derivation of your equation. Since in terms of your change in force, that would be equal to the force during the push minus force of the baseline. We're going to divide this into their individual components. So that would be the mass during the push times the acceleration due to gravity minus the mass of the baseline multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity. So this will just give us an equation of mass during the push minus mass of the baseline multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity. Okay? So that way, we can calculate it directly. So let's try to calculate for the one hand first. One hand, that would be equal to the delta F of the mass during the push, 61 kilograms, minus the mass of the baseline, which is 58 kilograms, multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity, 9.81 meters per second squared. So what would be the change in force or the increase force during the one-hand push? Guevara,
29.43 newtons po.
29.43 newtons. Okay, so that's correct. How about during your two-hand push? So let's write here. Two-hand. So delta F here is equal to 65 kilograms minus 58 kilograms multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity. Again, please don't forget to write the units. Delta F here becomes how much? Saraga.
68.67 N po.
Okay, so 68.67 newtons. In terms of the difference between the two-hand push and the one-hand push, you just have to subtract 68.67 newtons minus 29.43 newtons, which will give us a value of how much? Pareha.
39.24.
39.24 newtons.
Newton.
Okay? Is that correct? 39.24?
Yes po, yes po.
Okay. So these are the values. So to interpret this, the two-hand push produced 39.24 newtons more added force than the one-hand push. And this supports the idea that the two-hand pushing allows for more stable and greater force transmission. Okay? Now, in terms of the muscular system and the application of your action-reaction forces, muscles generate internal force, but the movement requires interaction with an external surface. So during walking, the feet pushes against the ground pushes the body forward and upward. During wall pushing, the hands push against the wall, and the wall pushes back on the body. During jumping, the legs push against the floor, and the floor pushes back on the body. So this is why movement is not only about muscle contraction, but it is also about how the movement or the body exchanges force with the environment. Okay? Now, in terms of the biomechanical meaning of your arm push, the arm push activity models the pushing, the lifting, the standing support, and the balance maintenance, the postural control, ergonomic force generation, and physical therapy movements. Now, the body does not move or exert force in isolation, and your movement actually depends on force exchange between the body and the environment. This is why the Newton's third law of motion is highly relevant in biomechanics. Every movement involving the ground, the wall, the floor, equipment, or support surface involves action-reaction force pairing. Okay? So to summarize, the wall push activity demonstrated your Newton's third law. When the student pushes against the wall pushes back on the student. The reaction force is transmitted through the body, and the scale reading increases because the normal force changes. Now, the main conclusion is that the muscular force becomes measurable through interaction with your external surfaces. Okay? And we have to connect your experiment 1, part 1, the part 2, and the part 3. So connecting them gives us an overview of how the body moves with regards to the kinematic and dynamic environment. Okay? Therefore, this experiment shows that biological movement can be measured using kinematics, and it can be explained using dynamics. Are we clear, guys? Can I get a thumbs up if everything is clear so far? Okay. So let me just stop the recording here.